Good evening and welcome to 6-1. A referendum on abortion is expected to be held here next May or June. The Taoiseach said the vote would follow on from the recommendations of the All-Party Oireachtas Committee on the 8th Amendment to the Constitution. The committee is due to report by Christmas. The 8th Amendment guarantees the equal right to life of the mother and the unborn. The vote will be one of 7 referendums which are expected to be held over the next 2 years.
It's 34 years since people voted on the 8th Amendment. It was contentious then, and the protests at the gates of Leinster House in the last week are testament to the challenge it still poses for legislators. But now it's an issue they will have to address after this confirmation from the Taoiseach today.
The proposal, or at least the indicative proposal, is to have a standalone referendum on the 8th Amendment in May or June next year. And that'll very much follow on from the recommendations of the All-Party Committee.
That committee will have to look at proposals to repeal the amendment which guarantees the equal right to life of the mother and the unborn. There are mixed views among its members as to whether they can get this work done by December.
We're trying to actually have, a conversation that with an end, where the deadline is for Christmas, but I wouldn't hold out on it.
This issue can be dealt with in 3 months, so long as we're willing to put in the time. And from what I gather from the committee, they seem extremely committed to attaining that goal.
A failure by the committee to get its report done on time could possibly delay plans for a May or June referendum. But most sides in Leinster House believe the timetable is workable.
I think it's something that certainly needs to be done, and I think minds are focused on having a referendum next year, and we would certainly support that.
This referendum is one of 7 the government is planning to hold over the next 2 years. But right now there isn't a plan to have a vote that would guarantee Irish water stays in state ownership, much to the surprise of some parties.
Why should Long finger a proposal which has universal acceptance from right across the spectrum, Fianna Fáil, the various independent groups, the alliances, Labour and indeed most of Fine Gael.
But finding consensus here on the wording of a proposal on the 8th Amendment may prove more problematic, however.
Well, Micheál is standing by for us now. May, June, it is a tight enough deadline, isn't it, Micheál, given the requirement for legislation to be drawn up and given the need for full and proper debate to be had on this most sensitive of topics?
After 34 years, Sharon, it is a tight deadline, but I suppose some things are different this time. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael TDs will have a free vote on this, so when that committee completes its work and proposals come back into the Dáil and the proposal that will ultimately go to the people is voted on, that perhaps should take some of the heat out of the debate and allow for progress on it. That is one of the key differences. And there's no doubting too that this is a big political priority, because while the government may be talking about 7 referendums over the next 2 years, there is a reality here that mapping the future for this government is a particularly difficult one, given the makeup of the Dáil and the uncertainty over its long-term future. So I think there is a certain energy behind this to try and make progress in the next number of months, and that could make the difference in getting it over the line in terms of getting a proposal to the people early next summer.
Micheál, thank you.
Just days. Independent TD Mattie McGrath and Senator Ronan Mullen have said they are considering whether or not to remain as members of the Joint Committee on the 8th Amendment. At a news conference this afternoon, Mattie McGrath outlined his concerns.
When we speak, we're ridiculed, there's sneers and there's all kind of undermining, and when we ask honest questions in a very calm manner, questions that we have prepared to our witnesses, which they don't mind being asked because they're coming in as experts, but there's all kind of gasps and whoos, and I've been called a liar by a committee member, which I didn't tell any lies whatsoever.
Well, let's talk now to our political correspondent, Micheál Lehane. Micheál, what are the concerns of Mattie McGrath and Ronan Mullen, and what's been the response, if any, from the committee?
Well, I suppose given the at times divisive nature of this debate, finding agreement during committee meetings was always going to prove to be a difficult task. But Ronan Mullen and Mattie McGrath say it runs a lot deeper than that, going so far as to describe the whole thing as a propaganda exercise. They're particularly concerned over what they say is a lack of time given to them to question witnesses, and they say too that they haven't got a chance to call in the witnesses or experts they would like to hear from. Now, in the last few moments I've spoken to the committee chairperson Catherine Noone, and here was her response to those criticisms.
I have been very fair and impartial in how the time has been allocated, and in many instances the two individuals who have made the complaints have had a lot more time than other members, and I have been very impartial at all times.
Brian, I suppose this row shows the difficult task facing this committee, but it is due to conclude its work by Christmas, but we don't know this evening if Matthew McGrath and Ronan Mullen will be a part of that process.
Micheál Lehane, Leinster House, thank you for that.
Members of the Oireachtas Committee considering the abortion issue have voted by a majority in favour of repealing the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, which recognises the equal right to life of the mother and the unborn child. The cross-party committee also voted by a majority to recommend making the termination of pregnancy lawful with no restrictions up until 12 weeks. The Taoiseach said today that it was achievable to have a referendum on the 8th Amendment by May of next year.
For the past 3 months here at Leinster House, 21 members of one committee have been considering recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly on the 8th Amendment. With the final public session due to take place this afternoon, there was anticipation over the first vote of the day on whether or not it would recommend to the Oireachtas that Article 43.3 be removed from the Constitution.
Obviously, it's the people who will decide at the end of the day, but I think that's the way the committee is going to go. We have been embedded in this committee for the last few months, and I think all of the expert witnesses that came in front of us were very helpful.
Well, I think this is a very exciting day for women who've been campaigning, like myself, for 34 years plus, to have abortion rights in this country.
The Labour TD Jan O'Sullivan made the proposal to repeal Article 43.3 from the Constitution, otherwise known as repeal simpliciter. That was countered by a proposal from Deputy Mattie McGrath.
It's my view, and I think the view of others on the committee, that a repeal simpliciter is the most clear way of dealing with the issue.
The deletion of Article 40.33 is not required to protect the life of the mother. It is possible to provide any additional clarity that may be required by medical professionals by way of ordinary legislation and/or amended medical practice guidelines.
14 members of the committee voted to recommend to the Oireachtas to repeal the 8th Amendment. 6 voted against, and the chairperson, Senator Catherine Noone, she abstained. Later, a majority of 12 members to 5 voted in favour of a motion to recommend dealing with the issue of pregnancy as a result of rape by making the termination of pregnancy lawful with no restriction up to a limit of 12 weeks.
I understand the points people are making, but this is proposing 12 weeks as outlined, and I think if we get overly prescriptive in whether it is medical or surgical, we potentially tie the hands of the experts.
The committee is continuing its meeting this evening. Alba Keneally, RT News, Leinster House.
For more, we're joined now by our political correspondent, Micheál Lehane at Leinster House. So, Micheál, to sum up, would it be correct to say the stage is now set for a highly emotive referendum at some stage next year?
Yes, Ray, I think this is a really significant moment because the laws around social issues can remain unchanged here for several decades, particularly if they cause unease within the political system. And then very suddenly the ground can shift and things can change in a way that seemed unlikely even a year ago. And I think we witnessed that this afternoon down in the committee rooms on 2 fronts. That decision to recommend repealing the 8th Amendment and also recommending abortion without restrictions to get around the complexities of cases of rape and incest without restrictions up to 12 weeks. They are big recommendations to come from that committee, and I know they're not binding, but this committee is important and you couldn't overstate its importance. That's because the report will go back into the Dáil, in a Dáil where a government doesn't have a majority, so they will be influenced more than ever by what this committee says. And we know too that there is a referendum on the way. The Taoiseach saying he hopes to have it in May. And much of the work around this in relation to legislation and perhaps proposals is already underway in the Department of Health. The Health Minister saying this morning that he is considering all options and is doing early preliminary work on that. That would suggest we could see legislation in February, and there is most likely going to be a referendum in May that is going to offer the clearest of choices.
Micheál Lehane, thank you.
Let's return now to our main story and that vote by the Oireachtas Committee on the 8th Amendment. We're joined now by its chairwoman, Senator Catherine Noone. She joins us from our Dáil studio. Catherine, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. This majority vote in favour of repealing Article 43.3. Is it your understanding now that the Oireachtas will press ahead with referendum wording and proposed legislation with this repeal at its core?
I would expect that our report will inform how the Oireachtas proceeds, so I think it would be fair to say yes to that question.
And we also have today, Senator Noone, this vote, I think it was 12-5, to allow for termination with no restrictions up until 12 weeks. Give us an insight into why we're looking at no restrictions.
Well, it's a very good question because it's important, I suppose, to inform the viewing public who aren't as engaged in the process as we have been, or indeed the people who have been watching it very closely. A consistent theme that has come up is the question of abortion pills. And I believe we voted the way we did today because as a committee, I didn't actually vote myself, I abstained, but as a committee we voted to cover situations where Irish women are procuring abortion pills online and taking them in uncontrolled environments. That was a huge informing factor in the decision that was made today, and it was an issue that Justice Lafoy pointed out as something that she felt that we should do more on, and we did, and it was a consistent theme.
So this will be, Senator Noone, a GP-led service. Was it also designed to deal with the intricacies of rape allegations?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, primarily, I should say that it was rape and incest, that reason that brought about this amendment in the first place, because the complexities of both of those very difficult scenarios are, I suppose, we're helped in legislating for those by going forward with the motion that we did today, right, or voting on that. Yeah.
Yes, and the committee also voted for terminations to be legal when not just the life of the woman is at risk, but the health of the woman. How do we define health in these circumstances?
Well, I suppose it's important that we remember that we're legislators and it's really up to doctors to decide on matters of health. And I think that was a predominant theme in our deliberations, the fact that, really we have to defer to doctors in these circumstances to determine the very question that you ask.
Right. And do you anticipate that there will be term limits on that particular issue?
On the issue of
health,
I mean, it'll be 12 weeks, I would imagine, based on what we voted on today. But beyond that, we didn't vote beyond 12 weeks on anything.
Okay.
And we didn't get into the gestational periods,
right,
that the Citizens' Assembly actually went through. We went about our work in a slightly different way, but the bottom line is that we made the decision that you referred to at the beginning there.
Right, and similarly, we also had a majority vote in favour of abortion in cases where the unborn child has a fetal abnormality likely to result in death before or shortly after birth.
Yes.
What more can you tell us about that?
Well, I think that there has been a lot of talk about this particular area, and I think the sincere expressions today were that empathy would be shown to women in those circumstances, that we got a lot of testimony on both sides of the argument, but that I think the majority, I don't speak for everybody obviously as chair, I speak for the committee as a whole, but I think the majority of people felt that in the case of fatal fetal abnormality, and indeed some people are uncomfortable comfortable with that definition. But in the case of those that the doctors need to be given some input, and that women would have some choice in those circumstances.
And Senator, finally, there has been quite a bit of acrimony throughout these proceedings. More of it today. The committee accused of being a lynch mob. Today, there was the criticism about pro-abortion experts being invited to give evidence. Do you anticipate a very fraught campaign?
I suppose, in a way, it's for another day. It has been a very difficult committee to chair, I have to say, and it is a very divisive issue, and I think naturally people are going to disagree on an issue like this, and I think that we need to be very respectful of everybody's views going forward. This process is a 3-stage process, and we're only just finished the 2nd stage, and it moves now on to the Oireachtas, and obviously the debate will intensify as we come closer to a referendum, and it is going to be difficult. It is a difficult discussion, and it was a difficult committee. It's difficult work, and it's work that has to be done. And, after the guts of 40 years of it not being dealt with, the Oireachtas are now dealing with it. And I think we should be proud of that fact.
All right. Well, Senator Catherine Noone, thank you very much for joining us on the programme this evening.
And sorry for delaying you.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Taoiseach has said he anticipates the Cabinet will act collectively in the upcoming referendum on abortion. Leo Varadkar also said there would be a special Fine Gael parliamentary meeting in the new year, and the Dáil will debate the issue.
What I would anticipate is Cabinet acting collectively, as it always does. So if we put a procedure or a proposition to the Dáil and Seanad, that would be a collective decision of the Cabinet. But that is not to say that people couldn't dissent from that. I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but Cabinet can only operate collectively. Even in the old days, when there were votes at Cabinet, and that probably hasn't happened for decades, you could have 8 people voting one way, 2 people voting the other, but they would all agree that this was the collective decision of the Cabinet, but that wouldn't prevent them from dissenting from it.
Our political correspondent Martina Fitzgerald joins us now. Martina, the Taoiseach providing clarity there on what the Cabinet will do. Is there any surprise in that?
Not really, because we had been hearing since last Wednesday, after the All-Party Oireachtas Committee had voted on its various recommendations, all the soundings for government was there was going to be a government position, and that ministers would be expected to toe the line when the legislation underpinning the holding of a referendum and the wording came before the Dáil. Now, why is that so interesting? Why would that not be normal practice? Well, because Fine Gael policy has that there would be a free vote on this issue. That will be decided at a special Fine Gael parliamentary party in relation to backbenchers, but I think he is clearly stating that he would expect a collective Cabinet decision on the issue, and it would have been difficult if a different scenario had been the case. But remember, there are different views within Cabinet and they have yet to discuss it. He also said he wanted a sound proposition put before the people, and there was still a lot more work to do, but he is holding to a May or June referendum.
Martina Fitzgerald, thanks for that.
Now, the final report of the Oireachtas Committee on the 8th Amendment has recommended that it should be repealed and abortion should be legal up to 12 weeks. However, a second report launched by 3 members of the committee favours retaining the amendment, which recognises the equal right to life of the mother and the unborn child.
Good afternoon, colleagues.
The audio-visual room at Leinster House was full to capacity this morning for the launch of the 8th Committee's final report.
I know that what the committee is proposing is a major change, and it will take time for both the public and other politicians in here to consider and understand how we came to these recommendations.
The report, which reflects votes by members last week, suggests repealing the 8th Amendment, decriminalising abortion and allows for terminations up to 12 weeks.
It was an amazing process. I mean, I learned so much. Of course, I went in there with a position, but I came out of it much stronger in that position and much more sure of how I felt about it. And that was because of the facts: scientific, human rights, legal.
3 committee members did not sign off on the final report. Instead, they made their own recommendations for the 8th Amendment to be retained and for it not to be put to a vote. The Minority Report also recommends that high-quality, appropriate perinatal and palliative care be provided across the country, and it calls for the provision of pregnancy counselling, which would encourage positive alternatives to abortion for women in crisis pregnancy.
I would hope that the Irish people in the end will insist on a law in this country that leaves no child behind, that guarantees every necessary medical treatment for women in pregnancy, as has been the case up to now in our law.
We're talking about human beings' life, and I don't think that should go to a referendum in a moment. And I said the earlier on, I'm disappointed that the Taoiseach of this country has stated that there should be a referendum even before the committee sit down.
The Dáil will debate the issue in January. The government now has to prepare the wording of a bill to hold a referendum. Alva Keneally, RTÉ News, Leinster House.
The Director
The Taoiseach has said that there is concern amongst many politicians that the proposal to allow abortion without restriction up to 12 weeks may go one step too far for the majority of the public. However, Leo Varadkar also said that he understood the logic of the Oireachtas Committee's recommendation, given the widespread availability of the abortion pill. Well, for more on this, our political correspondent Micheál Lehane joins us now. Micheál, there was a cabinet meeting around this today. What do you know of what was discussed at that?
Keelan, abortion is one of those issues that politicians simply don't like talking about. So this discussion at Cabinet today was the first substantive one really about the issue, and it went on for 2 hours, and I understand that all ministers spoke. They heard too from the Health Minister, who says a number of things have to happen if that expected referendum is to take place either in late May or early June. And they include making a decision on whether or not to accept the Oireachtas Committee's report that was published before Christmas. Also, having a referendum bill that will essentially pose the question that will be put to the people. And there is the accompanying legislation which will set out what would replace any possible changes in the Constitution. But of course, on that Oireachtas Committee's report, there was one recommendation that has been discussed more than most by politicians already, and that was the one that called for unrestricted abortion up to 12 weeks. And the Taoiseach has been speaking about that. He said that recommendation went further than many of the public, and indeed he himself could have anticipated 2 years ago. Here's what he had to say.
I understand the logic behind that and why they came to that decision, particularly given the widespread availability now of the abortion pill and the fact that people are getting that over the internet and are using it without medical supervision all over Ireland every day in homes and in all sorts of places. So I understand why they came to that decision, but I think people will want to think about that. There's a concern, understandably, among many politicians that perhaps for the majority of the public that proposal might go one step too far. But then again, perhaps not. So that's the debate we're going to have over the next few months.
And Micheál, listening to the Taoiseach there, I mean, a number of senior cabinet ministers have already said that they support this 12-week issue. How do you read the Taoiseach's comments?
I think they are significant. I think the fact that 7 members of the Cabinet have accepted the recommendations of the committee was seen that a majority were moving in that direction, and that perhaps is still the case. But the Taoiseach there reflecting a concern that is felt here in Leinster House that perhaps those recommendations may be out of kilter with a majority view of the public. Now, the question then is, does the government have any room to manoeuvre here? And it seems they don't. The sense I'm getting this evening is that any real altering of those committee recommendations would be politically fraught. Now, we will get a greater sense of political concerns here over the next few days. The Fine Gael Parliamentary Party will meet on Monday, and then over 3 days here at Leinster House next week, the committee recommendations will be debated in some detail. But I think what we've really got a sense of today is that this issue continues to pose a major political challenge and will do so in the months ahead.
OK, well, Micheál Lehane, thanks very much indeed for joining us.